So let's start today the celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. It's, for those of you guys who know, are Mexican or used to be Mexican like me, yesterday was Mexican Independence Day. Big round of applause for us. Right? And so in the past, I've done a presentation on the revolution and really how it affects us to this day. If you're a Mexican-American here in this country, it's an unfinished revolution. And so it really still does affect us. And my expertise is to find that which is completely forgotten, ignored, or otherwise not looked at or favored, and bring it to the forefront, particularly that part of history dealing with Hispanic history. So today I decided to focus on the Hispanics and how is it that we were really the first. I say we like I was there. Look at that. We were really the first of the anti-fascist. And I hope that I introduce you to some information, some historical events that perhaps you have never heard about. In fact, I hope that it really does inspire you to realize that not only are we really citizens and involved in part of this country from the beginning of its inception, but overall of the world. We have been and still continue to be great citizens of the world and influence its history. All right? So I didn't introduce myself. My name is Gerry Lopez. Let's try that again. Gerry Lopez, big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Hispanics versus the anti-fascist. I was reading a bunch of newspapers the other day, and maybe this has happened to you, and I was looking at a bunch of bad news, it seems like. They're telling us how there's an axis of, there was an axis of evil present, the good and the dark side, almost like a Star Trek episode. That there's some people who are either for us or against us, and the lines have been drawn. That there's an economy, a bad economy, and that economy is making the rift between the haves and the have-nots even wider and more accentuated. How in other countries, democracy is flourishing where it never flourished before. And some people think the United States is doing not enough, and some people are saying we shouldn't even get involved. After all, we have a bad economy, and what's our business getting involved in this? And overall, that there are certain countries that are losing it, that they're losing their power, they're losing their preeminence, and other countries are out there getting ready to take over. Do you recall reading those newspapers? Do you recall reading those news? Well, I have to say that you're either confused or a lawyer, Emma, all right? Because the newspapers I was referring to, I brought to you, they're from 80 years ago, and they were actually capturing at that time the essence of the world at the time. That really set a time for revolution, a time for reform, a time of crisis. And that's also an example of a history. History, there is an axiom that history does repeat itself. And quoting Santayana, or actually misquoting Santayana, if we do not learn from history, we'll be repeating it. And it looks like we're repeating it all over again. And so that's exactly what happened to the Spanish Empire. At this point in the 1920s, 1930s, the Spanish Empire was just a shadow of its old self. It had lost most of its holdings to a young teenager, the young kid in the block, the United States. That's a poster, a newspaper article actually from a Catalan newspaper, and it is saying the fault of Uncle Sam. It was a promising democracy, but what was his fault? That this teenager, as soon as it became strong, started acting imperialistically. And they're saying we have to guard our island. They were talking about Cuba, the War of 1898. After that, it just went really bad for the Spanish Republic. They lost most of their empire, most of their holdings. They got hit with the Depression, much like everybody else. And so it kind of set it into this whirlwind of chaos and anarchy and questioning everything that was old, and trying to introduce new ideas that were new. There was the old monarchy, and they were saying that doesn't work anymore. There were the new mentalities of democracy and voting and the right of people, but also socialism and Marxism and communism. The United States actually probably accelerated their demise, and in essence, the United States had a lot to do with what happened a couple of years down the road, a couple of decades down the road, which was a call for anarchy. Here you see anarchist, and anarchist literally means those who want no rule, but what they were really saying is no more church rule, no more Carlist rule, no more monarchy. A couple of Carlist rulers came in, and they were in Carlist, I mean by the line of the King of Spain, and they were acting almost, what's the word, dictator-like. And so they were saying what we mean by anarchy is no dictatorship. They were saying all dictatorship is fascism, and any dictatorship eventually will lead to fascism. And so you had this call on the streets. And in the 1930s, actually, there was this great period of turmoil in Spain where it pretty much split almost the north and the south, almost along those ranks. Now, at that time, the north was the richest part, and the south was the poorer part. The south was the lighter skin part. The south was the darker skin part. It's the same events that were happening in all the world. It is the same issues that we have in our world right now. It is the same issues that we have in our country right now, in San Jose right now, in our school system right now, in our achievement gap right now. So see, history does repeat itself, and we really can't run away from reality. We're still facing it. These people over here said, what's bad with the way things are? Let's just keep it the way things are. In fact, to this day, there's a separatist movement in Spain, and who do you think wants to separate from the rest of Spain? The north, the richer part, wants to separate from the rest of Spain. These people were saying, no, life is not as it should be, and we want change. And they try to bring it about by democratic change. They actually had elections, something that had never happened in Spain before. And the people spoke, and the people elected new magistrates and new rulers and new politicians. The monarchy saw the writing on the wall, and so they said, we're out of here. Much like any other monarchy, they don't like discomfort, all right? And so leaving, there was a power vacuum, and the socialist, the Marxist, the communist came in. And the people who were the church, businesses, and the rich, the ruling class, did not like the new situation. And so you have the stage set for nationalists against the Republicans. Now you're saying, Republicans? Aren't those the bad guys? No, in this case, they were the good guys. Although to tell you the truth, there are no bad guys, there are no good guys. Like the song says, there's only you and I, and we just disagree, all right? But in this case, the scene was set by those who said, no, we have a democratically elected government, and we have to put the republic together and maintain it together, were the Republicans. Interestingly enough, they were made up of groups of usually socialists and liberals. The nationalists, once again, most of the Army Corps, and we'll talk about this in a second, the Republicans were worker parties, socialists, communists, anarchists. Not those who really just wanted a helter-skelter kind of existence, but they wanted a new rule or a new change of rules. The largest of the worker parties were the POM, and the POM was a Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista. It was a Marxist group. Now, for those of you guys who don't know the distinctions between socialists, Marxists, and communists, it's easy to lump them all together, but they're very, very different, all right? And even the communists of that day were not the communists that we know of as of now. On the other side were the nationalists, and this is the term that they brought upon themselves. They were really the rebel groups, the ones who were saying, no, we have to overthrow the democratically elected government. They were Carlists, or the old Royalists, Catholic associations and foundations, Falangistas, blue shirts, and most of the officer corps. And whereas these saw themselves as heroic and the muscle of the people and the new man, the new Übermensch, that Superman that was going to emerge out of a rotten society, they themselves tended to classify the nationalists as bringing death, particularly in the form of fascism. And that became the dividing line. Those who were liberals, socialists, Marxists, communists, were Republicans, and those who were fascist, or as they used to call them, fascistas, were on the nationalist side. Now, as you would expect, they kind of hang around together. They have a club, and so fascists would support fascists. Francisco Franco is appointed ruler of the nationalist group, and immediately he seeks the help of Mussolini, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and Adolf Hitler in Germany. As a matter of fact, they met at a train station in Spain, and it was such an awkward video. You can actually YouTube it when you get a chance, and you see Hitler coming across very Germanic, very Prussian, which he wasn't. And Franco, very, very Hispanic, very, very almost, I'm going to jump on you and give you a hug, all right? And Hitler is ready to salute with his gloved hand, and Franco sticks out his hand, much like any other Hispanic would do when they meet you, right? And in that case, Hitler's seen fumbling with his glove and smiling and trying to take it off, and it's such an awkward time for Hitler. It's a blast. Watch it at parties, mar mitzvahs, anything, all right? And once again, the Generalissimo, Francisco Franco, who I understand is still dead. Yes, thank you. Thank you. A couple of you guys got it. I think I just dated myself. Actually, in college, I dated myself for quite a while, but that's a different story. Hitler, the Generalissimo. Easy, the superintendent is here. All right, keep it down. The old armed regime, the business class, and the church, very much on his pocket and on his side. An unusual alliance. However, it was necessary at the time. Germany and Italy support for the nationalists. It was easy for the Italians and the Germans to support the Spanish fascists. The symbol of the Falangistas, or the blue shirts, or the Spanish fascists, was the Jaras Unidas, which was a bunch of arrows. And also the Yugo. It was the not the Yugoslavian car, the Yugo, which is the yoke, the oxen yoke. Very biblical. I mean, there's a number of the whole concept that a strand of three strings cannot be easily broken, which is in Proverbs, and the do not be unequally yoked concept of the Bible. Yes, there was almost a marriage of fascism in this party and the Catholic Church, and it was easy for them to go back and forth and really almost feel like this is God's will for us. We have to defend our land against what? The socialists, the Marxists, the free thinkers, the liberals. This is a young fascist boy right there. They were actually much like Hitler later on with his Hitler youth. Young children were indoctrinized from early on by the church, by their life. The term fascia comes from Italian, fascio, which means a bundle. In Spanish, we have the word fajo. Cuando tienes un fajo de billetes, you have a fajo of bills. That means you have a whole bunch of bills. Fajo is just a fascist, and it comes from that term that something can be easily broken if you have one of it, but if you ply a number of things together, you cannot break it as easily. It's a good concept, but in this case, it has become defamed because the fascists actually used it. On the other hand, the Republican side, the left, they were clamoring to the world, please help us. Look at Franco, he has the help of the fascists, and we have nobody's help. Where are the democracies of the world? And much like right now, with the Arab Spring and other events of democracy emergence in the world, the democracies were quiet. We don't know why. Perhaps they didn't have the moral gumption, or perhaps they just didn't have the economic interest, but they did nothing. Such men as Andre Malraux, who wrote Man's Hope and a couple of other books, quoted Edmund Burke, an old English philosopher, and said, all that evil needs to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And it looked like at that time good men were not going to do anything. The world was quiet. The Italians and the German air forces came in, and in the guise of volunteer units, Hitler said, I can't stop them. They just wanted to go and help the fascists. In the guise of volunteer units, they brought their Henkel Junker planes and their Aeronautica Italian planes and landed in Morocco and picked up Generalissimo Franco's forces and brought them over to the mainland so they could start their attack on the Republican fronts. An interesting thing, because you got to understand that only about half of Spain was ever really conquered by the Moors, the Muslims, back in the 1600s. It was not until General Franco actually took Moroccan troops, or what they were known as the Pieds Noirs, which was the Blackfeet, and used these Moroccan troops to then help capture all of Spain. Ironic. What the Moors could not have done with their own generals, needed a Spanish general so that they could conquer them. Andre Malraux also fought in the small and somewhat ineffective, but very courageous Republican Air Force. The international brigades answered the call. There were some good men out there who said, hey, we can't let this happen. We can't just let this country disappear before the earth. It's a democratically elected republic. We have to do something. And so about 32 to 35,000 brigadists. These were volunteers from all over, many from Europe, many from the countries themselves that were fighting against the Republicans, Italy, Germany, Poles, a number of Soviets who came over to join, any people who were of socialist, Marxist, or communist tendencies wanted to back the Republic. They did not want the Republic to fall, including about 40 cadets from the Mexican military academy at Chapultepec came over. Argentinians, Bolivians, you see them. Actually, when they came in, they started grouping them up in brigades. and one of them was Batallón Español, which had Mexicans, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Chileans, Argentinians, and Bolivians. Hispanics made up about 10% of the fighters. They were indeed some of the first anti-fascists, some of the first good men that Edmund Burke and Andre Malraux would talk about and say, can anybody stand up and stop this fascist onslaught? And a great number of Hispanics said, we will do it. A great number of Americans also did so. There was about 10,000 non-combatant roles. A lot of these were also females, African-American socialist women, Americans who went and fight. Hemingway, who went and fought as actually he went to provide service as an ambulance driver. The Lincoln Brigade was formed, and these were Americans, many from New York and the East, some of them from California, who ended up saying, we will also go and we will fight to defend the Republic. There's an interesting history link to us and to the Lincoln Brigade, because the last brigadier commander, his name was Captain Milton Wolfe. There he is as a very young man. These were all very idealistic young men. Probably much like the young men who go to war in our day. Some of them don't know exactly what they're getting into, but many of them realize something has to be done, and we can't just sit here and do nothing. But Milton Wolfe he was from New York, but he lived most of his life after coming back from the war in Berkeley. And in fact, he died there. Can you imagine? Yeah. Now they won't sign up. I don't know why. Okay, it's just things have changed in Berkeley. All right. But they went in sometimes with their own money. Sometimes the Comintern, which was the Communist International, would fund them their trip. And a lot of them got tainted as communists, although many of them were not communist at all. In fact, later on, the reward was that the FBI would classify them as premature anti-fascist. Premature anti-fascist. Many of them joined the war effort in World War II, but they did not get promotions. They were not trusted, and many of them were classified forever as fascists, particularly in the eyes of McCarthy, who later on would carry out his Red Scare persecutions. The brigadists were very successful. Many of them did not have any training, but they had a lot of heart. And so they went in there and they started fighting, and they actually helped win a couple of battles, Battle of Guadalajara, Jarama. They were the pivotal groups that would bring in the victory for the Republican side. But the Germans just kept coming, and more volunteer units were sent from the Germans and the Italians. One of the battles that exemplified the barbarity of these attacks was when Guernica was actually attacked. It was at a small town in Bilbao. And the Germans and Italians, I gotta say this, they were under Spanish command. And so they were just doing what the Spanish were doing, were asking. Later on, Field Marshal Goering of the Luftwaffe, German Luftwaffe, would say, I spoke to Hitler and I told him we need to practice our tactics. And why not pick Spain? Let's support the Francoists and also at the same time practice our tactics. And one of the tactics that they had was, what would happen if Stuka divers and Helcom bombers would come in from one side of the town and move them to the other side of the town, and on the other side of the town we had tanks and infantrymen. Basically a form of blitzkrieg. And they tried it, and it worked out perfectly. They picked a Monday, which was a market day in Bilbao at that time, in Guernica. There was about 10,000 people in the market, and about 2,000 injuries, people killed, were actually counted on that day. It was a great success, but it also showed the barbarity of this war. It was a war, in Spanish it's called desenfrenada, which means with no brakes. Nobody would ever put the brakes on. Pablo Picasso at the time then painted his famous piece called Guernica, and in it he painted it in colors of shades of gray, because he wanted to show the dullness of the attack. He wanted to show the dullness and the feeling, and also he made it 15 feet high by about 30 feet wide. So people standing in front of it could see the dismemberment, the inhumanity, the death and destruction, and just the dull, cold field and immensity of it all. At this time, Picasso was for the Spanish Republic, and he was actually living in Paris at the time in exile. 17,000 massacre, and still the world did nothing except for President Cardenas of Mexico, another good man. President Cardenas of Mexico had fought in the Mexican Revolution, and he knew what it was to carry out a social revolution. He also knew that the social revolution had not been completely carried out in Mexico. And so as much of a liberal as he was, but really a humanitarian, he started sending two things, ships to take weapons to the Spanish Republicans. He sent Mauser rifles, machine guns. He sent millions and millions of Mauser cartuchos. What do you call those? Cartuchos? Oh, you're no help. Anybody? Cartuchos. Bullets. Good Lord. I'm going to have you guys all tested. All right? And the rifles that they would use would be these Mausers. In fact, this one right here is a Mauser from 1935. And it's from the Oviedo Spanish factory. So that's an actual rifle that was used in the Spanish Civil War. Do take a look before you leave today, but we're going to check your pockets, all right, before you leave. So don't even get any ideas. These ships would then come back laden with refugees. And here you have a group of refugees coming into Mexico. Negrín tenía razón, President of the Republic. Negrín was right. The fascists want to exterminate us. Viva Mexico, viva España, viva Cárdenas, viva Negrín. Many of these refugees were children. Mexico took about 20,000 orphan children. One of them was Plácido Domingo, who later on would grow up both a Spaniard and a Mexican. Right about this time, any of you guys who like the flamenco group, the Gypsy Kings, this is when their parents actually went into southern France to escape the Spanish Republicans. Mexico sends, Cárdenas sends his ambassadors to the United Nations. I'm sorry, that actually should be the League of Nations, and tells them, we have got to do something. We have got to act before fascism takes all over Europe. He was a canary. He was a red flag that went up, and nobody wanted to listen to Cárdenas or his men. And so almost by himself, he was the only Western country that accepted refugees, especially Jewish refugees. Cuba would not take them. The United States would not take them. Canada would not take them. On occasion, later on in the war, refugees full of Jewish people running away from the concentration camps were turned back to Germany, because no country would take them. The only place of solace was Mexico. A great time for our nation and for our history. The League of Nations was powerless, and here is pictured as a little bunny before the great international strife of the snake. It had no power. Unlike the United Nations right now, it had no military outlet to call people to armies to carry out its actions. Finally, the Republic capitulates in 1939, and the fascists take over. There is their emblem, the fascistas. En España amanece. It is morning time in Spain, it says, arriba España. But Hispanics kept on fighting against fascism. Not only did many of the Spanish Republicans decide to keep on fighting, and many of them did not give up. Many of them went into France to join the French military, which was about to fight in one more year against the Germans. Many of them went to the Foreign Legion, the French Foreign Legion, and many of them kept on winning into the Soviet Union to join them in their fight against the Nazis. Another good man that came up was this man. And has anybody heard of this guy? Oh, one of my heroes, Gilberto Bosques Saldívar, also known as the Mexican Schindler. Everybody knows who Schindler is, right? He was Mexico's Paris consul, a personal friend of President Cárdenas. He was also been in the Mexican Revolution. He was an avowed leftist and socialist. He was a career diplomat. And as soon as Cárdenas saw what was developing in Spain, he sent his man, Bosques. And he said, go out there and get as many people as you can out. And so he does. He starts issuing visas. They soon became known as Bosques visas. And if you got a Bosques visa, that means you were alive. That means you were saved. You can get on a Mexican ship and go back to Mexico and live free. David Katz, a famous Mexican historian, passed away just a couple of years ago. He would always tear up when talking about President Cárdenas. As many of the Mexicans call him Tata Cárdenas, because he also did a number of great things, expropriating the oil fields and then divvying out land to the poor. This is one of the Bosques visas. There is the Mexican consular seal. And if you got one of these, Walter Janca was a very lucky man. That means that you could get on a boat to Mexico. Who did he save? 40,000 people. Spanish Republican exiles, Jews, communists, anti-fascists, gypsies, mostly Spanish Republican exiles and Jews. He started just giving these things out. And people, he would tell them, just bring me a picture. And then when the people would say, I don't have a picture, one of his counselor staff of 40 would say, hey, I have a camera at home and I used to take pictures in Mexico. So they set up their own darkroom in the Mexican consular office in Paris. It was life to them. It was to those people who received these Vosquez visas, this was a time of receiving life. But they paid the price. The good always pay the price. In 1943, he and his consular staff, his wife and 3 children, were imprisoned by the Germans and held for a year. It is said that as they were still packing and the German Gestapo officers coming to arrest them, that they were still signing off consular visas to people outside of the windows. They were exchanged between Mexico and Germany in a prisoner swap. As soon as this happened, President Avila Camacho, there's a picture of him on the table when you get a chance to see it, the new president of Mexico, of course, telegraphed the Germans and said, hey, it's my consular staff. We have diplomatic immunity. You have to let him go. And so the Germans said, yet. No, they don't say yet. They say 9, right? Yeah, they say 9. Say 9, you know? And he said, okay. And so President Avila Camacho, in a very simplistic way of handling things, he said, identify all the German citizens in Mexico and arrest them, all right? And so he did just that. And then he said, okay, you want me to let go of your people? And some of them, of course, were family members of high officials in the German government. And so they had this prisoner exchange, but it was really more of a citizen exchange. Give me your citizens and I'll give you mine. And we got Consul Vasquez and his family and his whole staff back. Incredible man. Now Schindler saved 2,400 lives. That is nothing to sneeze at. Vosquez saved how many? Yes. Perhaps he should have been known as the German Vosquez instead of Vosquez known as the German Schindler. I'm just saying. I am just saying. This is the list that you see in the movie that the the Jewish clerk is fawning over and saying, the list means life. That's what a Vosquez visa meant to these people who ended up ending with these in their hand. Okay, there is Schindler, incredible man also, and there is the enamel works factory where he had his 2,400 Jews. It actually only needed to employ about 150, but somehow he found work for 2,400 Jews. Now, if you go to Israel, Avad Yashem, there is a garden in an area known as the Righteous Among the Nations Garden. And in there, they have the names of 2,400 men and women who were righteous among the nations. In order for them to qualify, they have to have been non-Jewish or non-Jewish converts, and they have to have helped Jews during the war. And it has to have been repeated, not just once, not just twice, because a lot of people did. It had to have been done over and at their own peril. They've identified 2,400 men and women. You will not find Vosquez's names there, though. You have to be sponsored by a Jewish group. There's a large community of Jews in Mexico City particularly, and they have over and over appealed to Yad Vashem to include him, but for some reason they haven't really taken up his application yet. Now there might be 2 reasons why he hasn't been included. Mexico inexplicably in 1947. You might be saying, man, this guy's incredible. He knows so many facts. How does he know all this? I'm making all this up, all right? So. You guys are going to check anyway, all right? Mexico, inexplicably, during the United Nations, which had been established in 46 and 47, it took the vote of granting Israel stateship. Mexico abstained. I have no idea why. The Soviet Union approved, but Mexico abstained. And maybe they're still kind of holding on to that. The other thing was Vosquez was a long-life leftist, and he was actually quite a supporter of communist Cuba. Now you might be saying, boo his, but Vosquez probably had an effect on your life also. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cubans, the Russians, and the Americans were at the brink of war, and now more and more data is coming out that shows us, my goodness, people almost pushed a button at that point. Our whole way of life almost came to an end. And I remember Einstein when he said, I don't know how World War II, who's going to win it, but I know that, I don't know who World War III is going to be won by, but I know that World War IV is going to be fought with sticks and stones, because there's nothing going to be left over. The Russians and the Americans and the Cubans come together and they're saying, let's talk. Let's kind of avoid this awful moment. And let's focus on it. Let's bring in a country that can act as an arbiter. And so they say Mexico, and let's come with a friend or a person that we can actually trust, and they bring Bosques in. Bosques was the essential person in bringing all these three parties together to avoid the, come up with a face-saving plan for Cuba and for the Russians to pull out their missiles. Probably something you didn't know. I'm not going to charge you for that one, all right? A Salvadorian among the righteous. Can Salvadorians be righteous? Apparently so. I didn't think it possible, but just kidding. The Salvador Consul General in Geneva saved 40,000 Jews by granting them Salvadorian citizenship. As a matter of fact, almost within the span of a year, Geneva became the home of the largest expatriate Salvadorian population in the world, because he handed out 1,300 consular visas, and each one of them could hold up to 11 people. And so a couple would come in and would say, can I get a consular visa? This was actually Colonel Jose Castellanos would write one for them and say, you guys have any family members? Of course, here's Uncle Chucho, and here's Tia Chona, and here's like La Tia Pelos. And they were like, okay, that's 11. Where's the next family? And this is the way that he saved 40,000 Jews. Now, these Jews did not have to leave Geneva. They stayed in Geneva, but they were actually Jewish Salvadorians, or on paper, they were Jewish Salvadorians. Maria Edwards de Errázuriz, righteous Chilean among the nations. And these people are included in the Garden of the Righteous. Married to a Chilean diplomat, she worked as a nurse. The diplomat, for some reason, committed suicide, but she decided to stay in Europe and not go back to Chile. She, as a nurse, rescued 2,500 Jewish orphans. These were children who were about to get put on a boat, on a train, and be sent to the concentration camps. And she, at her own peril, would take them out of the hospital and then give them to the French resistance. She also worked with the French resistance. For that, she was arrested, interrogated, and tortured by the Gestapo. She did survive, and in 2005, she was included among the righteous in Bad Yashem. This is Angel Sanz Briz, Franco's man. He was actually a Spaniard, a nationalist. Spanish diplomat in Budapest saved 5,200 Hungarian Jews by giving them Spanish visas. He and this other man are known as the Spanish Schindlers, and this was Eduardo Proper de Callejon. He was the first secretary of the Spanish embassy in Paris. He issued 30,000 visas in cooperation with Portuguese consul Aristides de Sousa Mendes. And once the Spanish foreign minister found out, he was recalled. However, he was placed in another posting. These men now are widely esteemed in Spain. Now, so not all the nationalists were bad. No, as a matter of fact, this, by the way, says, División Azul no muere, the Blue Division does not die, solo baja al infierno a buscar más Ivanes. It only goes to hell to kill more commies, all right? Within the nationalists, the nationalists, remember, their big impetus, their big drive was to protect the world against communism, which right now we don't have a threat from fascism. That's over. But our biggest threat is communism. Oh, well, wait a minute. The Russians, didn't that empire after 70 years implode? Yes. But our biggest threat right now is the Chinese communists. Well, aren't they more democratic? Well, you got to read some more stuff. Okay, maybe my next presentation will be on the Chinese communists. But the nationalists, they did not, they are wearing Nazi helmets, and this is a Wehrmacht 36M steel helmet, but a Spanish division, known as the Blue Division, went to fight with the Germans. But Franco, that was being, trying to be convinced by the Germans, join us against the Allies, join us against the Allies. And Franco said, I will not fight against the Allies, but I will fight against Bolshevism. So if I give you a division, you got to promise me you're only going to use them to fight in Russia. And so the Blue Division, as it was known. Why? Because most of these guys were Falangistas. They were from the Falange group. Remember the fascist group? And they wore blue shirts, and so we're known as the Blue Shirts or the Blue Division. Falangista itself comes from a Greek term phalanx, which means to hold arm in arm with your buddy and not let your line be broken. And that's what they saw. They really saw that marriage and family and church, and Republicans in here, should string together in a big phalanx and fight against socialism and these liberal thinkers, all right? Nothing has changed, people. That's what I'm saying. 80 years and nothing has changed. And here is the, it looks like a German soldier except for the mustache, the wine-smelling proboscis, and that they speak Spanish, all right? These are members of the Blue Division, and here is one bearing a caído, a fallen soldier. Many of them died in Stalingrad. Mussolini and Adolf Hitler were always trying to get Franco to join their side, but they couldn't. And so Franco thought, this is the way that I can appease my former allies and benefactors and actually still fight communism. But two groups started fighting. They were sent over in 1941, and they were recalled back in 1943. And that's because two groups started putting pressure on them. One of them was the Americans, who were saying, Franco, you're not really being neutral. We're going to have to invade you, all right? And Franco was very wary of this. And the other thing was that the Spanish public was actually seeing that, hearing of all the atrocities and all the persecution of the Germans. And so the Spanish public itself was saying, pull our division back. And so these are volunteers, Cordoveses, going to fight the Soviets, La División Azul. And this is something that somebody had to say about the Blue Division. What kind of soldiers were they? Well, to troops, the Spanish are a crew of ragamuffins. They regard a rifle as an instrument that should not be cleaned under any pretext. Their sentries exist only in principle. They don't take up their post, or if they do take them up, they do so in their sleep. When the Russians arrive, the natives have to wake them up. They sound like Mexicans, don't they? But I can say that because I used to be Mexican. But the Spaniards have never yielded an inch of ground. One can't imagine more fearless fellows. They scarcely take cover. They flout death. I know, in any case, that our men are always glad to have Spaniards as neighbors in their sector. Adolf Hitler, 1943. It's like being paid a compliment by the devil, isn't it? The Blue Division is recalled, and they are ecstatic. 20,000 men fought in the division. 5,000 were killed. 8,700 were wounded. 400 were captured by the Soviets, and 300 were returned in 1954. Now, the last thing I want to focus on is La Nueve. Who were the first liberators of France? Remember I told you that when the Spanish Republic fell, their armies dissolved, but a lot of these men just went on to fight with other groups. Many of them went to fight with the Free French. La Nueve, as it was known, was part of the 13th Battalion of the Foreign Legion, French Foreign Legion. These guys ran away to Morocco and got ready for the next fight. Also, immediately after the war, about 10,000 went to join the French infantry, and about 55,000 went in as laborers, getting ready for the German attack of France. They were still fearless fighters, even the laborers. There's an episode where a French line of infantrymen see the German coming, and they retreat in total disarray, dropping their guns. And the Spanish laborers go into their positions, pick up their guns, and start fighting the Germans. The La Nueve, as you can see, well, they look like American soldiers. Yes, they look like American soldiers. As a matter of fact, they were the first company to go into Paris to liberate it. And when they walked in, everybody started saying, the Americans are here, the Americans are here. But they start speaking Spanish to each other. Huh? What kind of Americans are these? Well, they were actually, they had American equipment, but they were La Nueve. They were a Spanish company. They were the first to liberate France. De Gaulle later on will review them. Here's La Nueve being American equipment, American, German, French commanders, and everything American. He will review them and fill them with accolades, but later on he goes before the people, the public, and the radio, and he says, aujourd'hui la France est libérée par les Français. Oh, yes, I speak a little French also, just enough to order at a restaurant, really, but sounds impressive. France today is liberated by the French. But he was lying. Paris was actually liberated by the Spanish, all right? Little known fact. The Mexican suitcase. Back in 1990, the ambassador to Paris dies, and people are going through his stuff. And they realize that he has a couple, they call it a suitcase, but it was actually more of a couple of cardboard boxes. And in it, they find 126 rolls of 35 millimeter film with 4,300 images. The photographers were Robert Capa, who also did the picture that fell, apparently. Oh, there it is. Of the Republican soldier getting shot. It's called Loyalist Being Shot. Gerda Taro, who was Robert Capa's girlfriend, and David Chim Seymour. They include images of the American writer Hemingway, André Malraux, and the Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca. Almost as if Hispanics were still holding on to this secret, saying, look, just when we thought we had forgotten them, here's a little bit more history for you to have. On behalf of all Mexicans, you're welcome, all right? Hispanics were the first to combat the worldwide threat of fascism. Even as World War II exploded, Hispanic diplomats continued to fight the Axis powers, were granting life to freedom to tens, I would say hundreds of thousands. They were the first to liberate Paris and the first to combat communism, which to this day still threatens the West. They were the good men that did something so that evil could not triumph. That is the role of Hispanics as first of the anti-fascists. I hope that you learn a couple of new things. I hope that you have been inspired. I hope that you have a better appreciation in this day and in this month that we celebrate Hispanic history. I want to thank a couple of people, the Santa Clara Cafeteria Committee for the generous contributions of the snacks, all right? When you see any member, myself being a member of the committee, I don't know how I got in there, they provided the money for this. John and the entire Lunch Stop team, they came in a little late, but the food is delicious. I hope you enjoyed it. Tony Cordova and Lindsay and Jeremy for videotaping this presentation so that the alternative education students and the rest of the SCCOE staff who cannot make it can enjoy it with us on the intranet. Dee Blevin and Mike Broomberg for their provision of posters and visuals. For Barbara Coates and Kyan Eastman for allowing us to present the artifacts associated with this event. And yes, they're all unloaded, all right? Yeah. Dr. Angelica Ramsey for her support of this event, and all of you also for your interest in Hispanic history and for joining us and not forgetting and in celebrating these brave men and women. Please, big round of applause for these brave men and women. Thank you. Now, speaking of brave men and women of a Hispanic heritage background, I'm going to invite Deborah Avella to come back over here, our migrant director, because I did not forget her. I do want to thank Deborah for all her support. This is our 5th year that we do something in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month, and I want to thank Deborah from the bottom of my heart for giving me support. I know that this kind of like, are you going to do it again? You're too busy.
No,
you're too tired. But as many of you guys know, tomorrow will be her last day with us here at the county. She's retiring. So as we close, and I play some of the songs of the Spanish Republic. Her husband is Spanish. I'm so sorry you couldn't make it. Please come up and say your goodbyes to Deborah. Thank you so much for joining us. And, and we will see you, I hope, next year with another presentation. All right?
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.